Greetings everybody and welcome to one of our Flowgear bite-sized videos, the purpose of which is to get you, the integrator, up to speed with some of the very important features and concepts within the Flowgear platform. And on top of that, we'll be looking at one of our very common use cases. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to log into our Flowgear tenant. Now we will have provided you with a Flowgear tenant ID. You can see I've plugged mine in on the top here, and then you'll obviously provide the user against which you would like to authenticate. Once that's been done, you can go ahead and click on Next, and that's going to log you into the Flowgear console. Now, based on the user you provided, your role will determine what you can and can't do. So through role-based access, effectively, you'll be able to navigate to certain portions of the Flowgear console. Now, ultimately, each of these Flowgear tenants is deployed against its own VM, which is going to provide you with a maximum level of separation and security. Now, the primary purpose of the console is to provide you, the user, with a space in which you can seamlessly transition to the different elements of the platform that you may find yourself working with. How this is functionally done is through selecting any of the navigational elements of on the navigation bar on the left-hand side. Let's start at the bottom, and we can go through a handful of these. Starting with drop points. Drop points are a lightweight agent that you can install on-prem, which is going to facilitate a persistent outbound connection to the primary Flowgear environment. What this functionally means is, irrespective of where your primary Flowgear environment is hosted, you're going to be able to install this tool directly on another on-prem system and still be able to get data to and from your Flowgear environment and the system in which you've installed the tool against. Connections are a place to plug in credentials unique to a particular platform or product. So if we open up one of our connections, just as an example, Salesforce, you'll notice that we can plug in credentials that would serve to authenticate you with Salesforce. And we'll be specific around what we require within the naming of the particular properties. And you can also take a look at our help article, which is going to give you an idea of what each one does and how you could potentially acquire it. Now, you can effectively go and test against that as well using the test connection button. There we go. You will then note that you have in fact been able to connect to that environment. You'll also see that you can go and click on different environments here. Test UAT in production. Functionally, this allows you to plug in different sets of credentials for the different environments you may own or have access to. Now, you can customize this. You can have additional environments. You can change their names. You can remove some. Ultimately, we're not always aware of what your environment looks like in terms of lifecycle management, so you get to set it up according to what your current policy or procedure has been up until this point. It also plays a large role in how we do lifecycle management in general within Flowgear, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. Now let's take a look at workflow logs. This is a place in which we are able to store the transactional inputs and outputs of all the nodes that have executed within the platform. And you can see what those inputs and outputs are here. You can also redact that as well. So anything you do not want to be stored can be redacted and therefore will never be stored on the Flowgear platform. And functionally what this place does is it allows developers or anybody developing or maintaining these solutions to have a very good view of what has happened on the platform so that they could potentially debug and solve a problem should one arise. It's not going to fill the purpose of reporting to your end users or integration reporting in general. Those kinds of tasks whereby, as an example, you want to report a number of invoices processed, which of them failed and why they failed, that would be something that is built alongside the workflows themselves. Finally, we can take a look at workflows. Workflows are the design canvases on which we actually build these solutions. So here's where we then facilitate that drag and drop and low to no code design. And we're going to go ahead and open one up and give you a bit more detail around what that looks like. Let's go ahead and open up a brand new workflow. You can go ahead and do this by clicking on the new workflow button over here. We'll then have a randomly generated name, which of course you're welcome to change. And we can go ahead and confirm that on the bottom right. We're then greeted with a Flowgear design canvas, the primary purpose of which is to expose all of Flowgear's pre-built tooling so that you, the integrator, can drag and drop that onto the canvas and then build some kind of integration or automation, really to whatever level of complexity you require. Now, as I've said, there's a big emphasis on drag and drop, and there's an emphasis on low to no code based on your preference and the kind of tools you'd like to use. Now, how we can expose these tools to the canvas is by clicking on any of the plus icons you see popping up as I hover around. And we're then going to be greeted with these tools as a list of nodes. We call them nodes. They're best described as elements that can be dropped onto the design canvas that will then provide a particular integration process. So in other words, they're going to be doing something for you. Now, depending on what they're doing for you, we'll have them categorized into one of 4 distinct categories. The very first category is our connectors. They will effectively connect to the systems that we want to integrate and automate, and they do this by exposing as much of that vendor's API functionality as is possible, and exposing those actions at something called samples. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but you'll see exactly what that looks like a little bit later. We then have triggers. Triggers will determine the condition upon which a workflow executes. So in other words, it allows you to determine whether your workflow should execute once daily, based off of an email arriving in an inbox, a particular queue. There are a number of mechanisms to determine whether your workflow should kick off. Processes are going to work with data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prepare it for the next stage, whether that's one of many or the final stage of ingress. Effectively, what these nodes will do is ensure that you can enrich, supplement, transform, and validate the data to get it into the systems that you're actually attempting to integrate with. And finally, flow control gives you the ability to enable conditional branching on the canvas, and that conditional branching will form the high-level logic for things like error handling, business logic, any kind of decision making that the workflow has to actually make, even if that data has to be handled by a separate workflow or anything of that sort. Now, ultimately, it's a collection of all of these nodes that allow you to build these integrations to whatever level of complexity you require. Triggers are then going to facilitate the condition upon which the workflow executes. So it will determine whether your workflow should kick off twice daily, once an email arrives in a particular inbox, monitor a particular queue. There's a number of options for why a workflow would or wouldn't kick off. We then have processes, the primary purpose of which is to go ahead and work with the extracted data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prep it for the next step, whether that is one of many steps or the final step of ingress. Functionally, they will go ahead and transform, enrich, validate, and supplement those data sets so that you can move them across to the systems you want them to be in. Finally, we have flow control. Flow control nodes will allow you to enable conditional branching on the canvas, which forms a big portion of your high-level logic or decision making. This could be error handling. This could be determining whether a particular process has to be kicked off by a sub-workflow, whether an invoice has to be processed with a different kind of mapping. It is once again going to allow you to make a lot of the decisions that make up your production-ready workflow. It is, of course, a collection of all of these different categories that allow you to build these integrations and automations to whatever level of complexity you require. Enterprise API gives you the ability to turn any workflow into an API-bound endpoint. This means that through the typical design experience within Flowgear, you can go ahead and expose some of that functionality or data to a web endpoint, which can then be consumed by a third-party application or program that has the ability to do so. So here, in a very brief example, we're extracting information from SQL, we're mapping that into a JSON payload, and we're functionally exposing that to an endpoint that somebody can consume. And we can see how this is done by heading over to Settings, Workflow Settings, and we'll notice that we've applied a get binding to this workflow. We have our demo domain, of course, which should be customizable according to your tenant, and then we have the actual URL for test contacts. And should somebody have this URL and the appropriate access token, they can go ahead and extract a list of contacts from the database that we've hooked up within Flowgear. Revision management is a feature which allows you to inspect the design of a previous version of a workflow. You can do so by clicking on the revision history button over here. And then you can take a look at the different versions that had been saved in the past and open up any one of them. That provides you with the design of that workflow at the time that it was saved. You can then even revert to that version as the latest version by saving over the workflow, and you'll be expected to ensure that you are happy to do so by confirming with a yes for confirmation. Revision management is one of the many tools Flowgear exposes as part of our lifecycle management suite. Release management is another powerful feature within Flowgear's suite of lifecycle management tools. Release management works by preventing workflow design changes from immediately affecting production. This is done by enforcing the process of a user with the appropriate permissions promoting workflow design across the relevant environments until it is ready to be promoted into production. Let's take a look at how this is actually performed. So here we have a workflow which we're going to go ahead and save. We can provide a save or commit message over here. And then we'll receive confirmation of the workflow being saved through the green banner. At which point we can go ahead and open up the release management by clicking on this button over here. We will notice that this particular workflow has a version in test, but none in UAT or production yet. And so what we can do at this point is we can actually promote the workflow across to UAT. This will then allow us to execute the workflow in the UAT environment using the credentials that were provided in the connection under the UAT tab. And then once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and do the final portion by promoting this into production. Similarly to what I've just done. Now you're welcome to use the UI that Flowgear exposes to do this, but realistically what's happening in the back end is these particular designs are going to be stored as GitHub commits. And so you can actually see a text-based version of the workflow, which you can then compare against older versions. So while you're welcome to use it in the manner that I've just shown you, ideally you're able to forklift whatever your lifecycle management policy and procedure is into something like a GitHub environment and effectively run your pipelines and your commits and approvals as you've been doing up until now. All right, on to the problem we're looking to solve today. So at a high level, what we're doing is we are doing some PDF file processing with the intent to consume a sales order in the form of a PDF and then pass that across to Syspro as a sales order. Now there's really two things happening here. One is we want to show you what some of our PDF processing tools look like, and we'll focus mostly on that. And then we'll also touch on what it looks like to get the data into Syspro as well. At the end of this, you should have a good idea of how to use one of our PDF parsing tools, as well as the Syspro branded connector. As always, let's take a look at what this integration is actually supposed to be doing for us. So what we'll first do is navigate to the source document to take a look at what that actually looks like. Here we can inspect that PDF, which is effectively an invoice, contains some customer information and a couple of line items with quantity description, the usual thing. And so, of course, we're going to want to interpret this PDF and pass it along to Syspro. Back on the canvas, we can go ahead and actually execute this workflow from point to point. We'll wait as the activity logs pop up and show us what's happening and just give this a chance to finish this process. Now that it's finished, let's go ahead and expand the activity logs. We will go into more detail around all the different steps that have taken place here, but we simply care about the output for the time being. So let's take a look at the response from Syspro, where we can take a look at what that response XML is and see that we were in fact successful in creating that order. So we want to grab that sales order ID and we're going to go ahead and look for that within Syspro. Let's go ahead and plug that particular order ID that I've just copied into our sales order point. And we can wait for that to query, where we'll find we have got an order assigned to a particular customer. And as we saw with the line items on the PDF, we've got citrus boxes and citrus boxes large with the appropriate order quantities and the appropriate pricing as well. Now that we know what this does, let's take a look at how it does it. Now that we're sitting with a blank canvas, let's take a look at some of the effort we have to put in to actually get the integration into the state that you saw it previously. Now, we'll be taking this at a very high level, so we'll mostly be focusing on the extract, transform, and load, but we can still touch on some of the things you might have seen in the previous workflow, which was a little bit more production ready. That being said, the first thing we want to do is go ahead and extract that invoice and get it onto the canvas. Now we can do so using a number of different methods, but as per the previous example, we got that through a file node, which we can then use to extract that data. So let's go ahead and put a file node onto the canvas. We will want to set up a connection for that file node, so we can pick my NIC laptop. So it simply uses a drop point to get to that folder, and we'll go ahead and plug in a path soon. Now we can go and grab, of course, the OpenAI PDF parser. There's going to be a couple of uses of this node actually, and I'll explain that in a second. But for all intents and purposes, we can keep it simple for now. Go and plug in a quick map. And then finally, we can go and plug in Syspro. This represents the basic steps that we're looking to perform: extract the file, pass the file, map it, and then pass it to Syspro. Now, let's go and get all the connections set up for both sides. So I've picked my connection for my file node. I can pick my connection for OpenAI document parser. We can go ahead and pick our connection for Syspro. And at that point then, we're going to want to actually plug in the path for the file itself. We'll just copy what's on my clipboard. And we can even test this in isolation to ensure that we are actually seeing this file. So it won't be content type text, it'll be content type binary. And we want to read it, and let's see if we can get anything back from my PC. So that we have a successful execution, and we do have some content that we can work with. So that content then effectively needs to go to the document itself. And now what usually happens is we can simply run this particular process, but we do need to provide a validation script and a schema. Now, what's important here is the OpenAI document parser can actually provide both of these for you. You would typically run different actions, such as create schema and validation script, and then you'll use those as part of your processes going forward, and you can provide them as configuration variables or whatever. We can actually do all of this in one step. So actually, what we have then at the end of the day is 3 of these nodes running one after the other. Go ahead and plug all these in as necessary. And they're going to have their different actions. So first of all, we want to be able to generate the schema. Then we want to be able to generate the validation script. And then we can pass both of those into, first of all, the schema, validation script, and then the final action will be the passing of the document itself. And we can hook all of these execution flows up one by one to start the process of actually getting the data out of the file. We can just go and provide a generic document name for now. We don't really care too much at this point. And then we're going to go ahead and execute this. Keep in mind, you only have to execute the portion that creates the schema and the validation script once generally. You can then store those values as a configuration variable, but for the purpose of the demo, I'm showing you how we generate each separate section and then feed it into the last step, which then passes the document. But as always, let's go ahead and execute this particular workflow, and then we can take a look at the activity logs. Now that we have our logs, let's take a look at what's actually happening. So we generated the schema first of all. We fed the schema and the original document into the next step, which was validation script, and got that back. And then the last portion is feeding both schema and validation and the document in, and that gave us this particular invoice information over here. And so we can actually work with this data. So let's go ahead and set this value on the node, close our logs. And what we want to do then is make sure that the quick map is aware of the data coming from the OpenAI document, OpenAI, sorry. And then, of course, on the Syspro side, we're going to go and say options, choose sample. That surfaces a list of potential actions that we can perform against Syspro. There's hundreds in this case, but many of our branded connectors have thousands or tens of thousands. The idea is that through some mechanism that we consume, we can surface the potential actions that the user would want to perform. So Syspro works with business objects. We're going to look for sortoy, which are sales order transactions. Click on that, and that configures the Syspro node for the action of actually creating sales orders, and we'll make sure that the result from the quick map is aware of what the data needs to look like from the data XML, which you can see an example of that here. At this point, we can head over to the mapping by clicking Change View, and we can actually begin to map the data across from point to point. Let me switch over to a complete mapping, and then we can talk to some of these features. Here we have our completed mapping. Now, first of all, the purpose of this tool is to make it a significantly easier effort to map data across from point to point. You can see 2 data trees on the left and on the right-hand side, representing the source being, of course, our PDF, and then the right-hand side being Syspro. And so the idea is that you can drag across fields and structures as you need them to then be represented in a preview on the right-hand side in the structure that Syspro, in this case, expects it, but of course using the data from the source, which again is the PDF. So what this will do is significantly reduce the amount of effort you would normally have to approach with this. But of course, it's going to also have a number of other features where it's not just about the data of the structure of the data, it's also about further enriching and supplementing that data. Now, how we do that is we have our filter expressions, which you can see me click on these blocks. And within them, we can provide a list of functions that will then take the data to a next level. You're welcome to take a look at what those functions are, but generally you can expect things like sum, count, lookup, if statements, string and math operations. And the intent of that is to then ensure that if you have to do something beyond the structural mapping, you can do that. Now we have a couple of examples here. Here's our complete mapping. We've got everything mapped up that is required, and we've got a couple of hard-coded values, such as in this case the customer code, just because we want to make it easy for the demo. We've got line action types. Then we have a lookup on the stock code. So effectively the stock code coming from the PDF and that which is in Syspro might not necessarily relate. So we can actually do a lookup on that, and I'll show you what that lookup table looks like shortly. We have the ability to provide the current date and customize the date structure. You really can do whatever you need to make sure the data looks exactly as it should. Let me close this off for a second, and we can take a look at the actual lookup. So here you have the product intact SKU. Well, this is actually incorrect. This is the Syspro SKU. Apologies. And then the description coming from the source PDF, of course. So that's the mapping phase complete. And then if we swap back to the other workflow, we can then, of course, hook up the execution points from point to point. So you already saw it execute the particular document here. And then at this point, we could execute against that to put it into Syspro. Now, we will obviously go back to what we did previously so we can expand on some of the other elements that you saw within the scope of this integration. What we just built is the basic ETL portion of an integration. It is very important. It forms the core of practically any kind of integration automation you want to build. But let's touch a bit on some of the other elements that you might have noticed when we initially executed the workflow. So for our more complete or slightly more production-ready workflow, we're not just hard coding a value within the scope of a particular file. On the read file, we're actually looking for new files in a particular folder. That process is executed every 60 minutes from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. We then only have a single stage for the OpenAI parsing because we already have the schema and the script saved. So that's something we generated previously. As again, very important. You only have to do those once, and then you can provide it as is to the OpenAI document parser. From that point, we go and map it. We then check if that document actually exists. So have we already processed it before? Attempt the transaction in Syspro, and then we read the output to determine if it was successful or not, and whether we should log a success or a failure, where then a secondary or utility workflow can come through and actually determine if something had failed, what the remedial action should be for that particular transaction. Now that concludes the demo. I hope that what we've been able to show you here today is not just the use of the very important nodes that make this possible, such as our OpenAI document parser, but of course as well the process of what needs to happen in between all of those steps. There are help articles that you can take a look at to get some more information on these nodes and how they're used, and some samples as well. If you're interested in exploring some of the concepts and features that I've just shown you in more depth, you're welcome to head over to help.flowgear.net, where you'll find a list of comprehensive articles giving you more detail on some of the things that I've shown you today. On top of that, you're welcome to sign up for a free trial and explore Flowgear at your own pace. We do have a certification course available that'll take you through some of the foundational elements of Flowgear. And then finally, if you'd like, you're welcome to reach out to our team and inquire about a complimentary proof of concept where we can go ahead and show you some of what you're looking to achieve as part of the POC process.